The phone call Kurt Cobain made 48 hours before his death. What he said changed everything. On April 6, 1994, at 11:47 p.m., Kurt Cobain made a phone call from Seattle. The person who answered that call would never speak publicly about what Kurt said, but 3 people overheard parts of that conversation, and what they heard suggested that Kurt wasn't planning to die. He was planning to leave, to disappear, to start over somewhere nobody would find him. That phone call lasted 19 minutes. When it ended, Kurt told the person on the other end, "I'll see you in 3 days." But Kurt Cobain never made it to that meeting. 2 days later, he was dead. Or at least, that's when police say he died. But the people who heard that phone call, the neighbors who saw lights in Kurt's house after he was supposedly dead, and the friend who received a message from Kurt's pager on April 7th, they all tell a different story. It was a cold, Seattle night, April 6th, 1994. The kind of night where the rain feels more like mist, where everything is gray and wet and quiet. Dylan Carlson, one of Kurt Cobain's closest friends, was at his apartment in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood when his phone rang at 11:47 p.m. Late-night calls weren't unusual in their circle. Musicians kept strange hours, but something about this call felt different. "Dylan, it's me," Kurt's voice came through the line. He sounded tired but clear, not slurred, not high, just tired. "Kurt, man, where are you? Courtney's been calling everyone. She thinks you're missing." There was a pause. Dylan would later describe that pause as significant, like Kurt was choosing his words carefully. "I'm at the house," Kurt said. "I've been here for a couple days, just thinking, making some decisions." Dylan Carlson has never publicly revealed the full content of that conversation. But in private, over the years, he shared fragments of what Kurt told him that night, with a small circle of friends. And those fragments painted a picture of someone who was planning a future, not an ending. According to what Dylan shared, Kurt talked about leaving Seattle. Not temporarily, permanently. He talked about going somewhere remote, maybe Oregon or Northern California, somewhere he could disappear for a while. He talked about how tired he was of the music industry, of the fame, of the constant pressure. "I just want to be nobody for a while," Kurt apparently said. "Just be a regular person. Maybe work on a farm or something. Get away from all of this." Dylan asked if Kurt was talking about rehab again. Kurt laughed, a tired laugh. "No, man, not rehab. I'm talking about actually leaving, like disappearing, starting over." "What about Frances?" Dylan asked, referring to Kurt's daughter with Courtney Love. Another pause, a longer one this time. "That's complicated," Kurt said, "but I've been talking to someone, a lawyer, about custody, about options." The conversation went on for another 15 minutes. Kurt talked about music he wanted to make, about getting back to the raw, simple sound that had inspired him in the first place. He talked about maybe forming an E-band under a different name, playing small clubs where nobody knew who he was. "I'll see you in 3 days," Kurt said before hanging up. "There's something I need to give you. Something important. Can you meet me on the 9th? Dylan agreed. They set a time and place. And then Kurt hung up. Dylan Carlson went to sleep that night, thinking his friend was planning a new chapter in his life. 2 days later, Kurt was dead. But here's the thing that Dylan could never reconcile. If Kurt was planning to meet Dylan on April 9th, why would he kill himself on April 5th, the day police claimed he died? The timeline never made sense to Dylan. And he wasn't the only one who noticed the inconsistencies. Jessica Hopper was Kurt and Courtney's neighbor on Lake Washington Boulevard. Her house was close enough to the Cobain property that she could see their driveway and the greenhouse room above the garage from her bedroom window. Jessica has given very few interviews over the years. She's a private person who never wanted to be part of the Kurt Cobain story. But in a 2009 conversation with a documentary filmmaker, Jessica shared something that contradicted the official timeline of Kurt's death. "I saw lights in that greenhouse room on April 7th, Jessica said. "It was late, maybe 10 or 11 at night. I was up with my baby who wasn't sleeping well. I was standing at my bedroom window, rocking her. and I saw lights on in Kurt's greenhouse. Not just lights on like someone left them on. The lights moved, like someone was walking around in there with a flashlight or a lamp. The official timeline states that Kurt died on April 5th, sometime in the morning. If Jessica saw lights moving in that room on April 7th, 2 days after Kurt was supposedly dead, then either someone else was in that room or Kurt was still alive on April 7th. Jessica reported what she'd seen to police after Kurt's body was discovered. But according to Jessica, the detective who took her statement didn't seem particularly interested. He wrote it down, Jessica recalled, but he kind of dismissed it. He said maybe it was a reflection or maybe I was mistaken about the date. But I wasn't mistaken. It was April 7th. I remember because it was the night before my daughter's pediatrician appointment, and I was up late worrying about it. Jessica saw something else that night too. Something she didn't mention to police at the time because she wasn't sure if it was relevant. I saw a car in the driveway, Jessica said. A dark-colored sedan. Not Kurt's Volvo. A different car. It was parked there for maybe an hour, and then it left. I thought maybe it was a friend visiting or something. But later when I found out Kurt was supposed to be dead for 2 days already, I wondered who was driving that car. The car Jessica described was never identified. Police never investigated who might have been at the Cobain house on April 7th. The official story was that Kurt died alone on April 5th, and his body wasn't discovered until April 8th. Any evidence that contradicted that timeline was apparently dismissed or ignored. But Jessica wasn't the only witness who saw activity at the Cobain house during those supposedly empty days between Kurt's death and the discovery of his body. Mark Lanigan was a musician and friend of Kurt's. On April 7, 1994, Mark was in Seattle recording at a studio in the Ballard neighborhood. Around 2 p.m., Mark's pager went off. He checked it and saw a familiar number. Kurt's pager. In the 1990s, before cell phones were ubiquitous, people used pagers to communicate. You'd page someone, they'd see your number, and they'd call you back from whatever phone is nearby. Kurt and Mark had been paging each other for years. Mark knew Kurt's pager number by heart. The page from Kurt's pager that afternoon included a callback number and a short numeric code that Kurt and Mark used to communicate. The code translated roughly to "call me, it's important." Mark tried calling the number back several times over the next few hours. Nobody answered. He figured Kurt was busy or had stepped away from wherever he'd been when he sent the page. It wasn't until days later, after Kurt's body was found and the news reported that Kurt had been dead since April 5th, that Mark realized something was very wrong. If Kurt died on April 5th, who sent that page from Kurt's pager on April 7th? Mark shared this information with police. Like Jessica's account, Mark's story was documented but never seriously investigated. The official explanation was that maybe Mark was mistaken about the date, or maybe the page was sent earlier and Mark didn't check his pager until April 7th. But Mark was certain. He had the pager log. The page came through on April 7th at 2:17 p.m. It was time-stamped. There was no mistake. Someone had Kurt's pager on April 7th. Someone who knew the codes Kurt used to communicate with his friends. Someone who was trying to reach Mark Lanigan. Was it Kurt, or was it someone else who had access to Kurt's belongings? These questions led to more questions. Questions about where Kurt had been in those final days. Questions about who he was with. Questions about what really happened in that greenhouse room above the garage. Rosemary Carroll was Courtney Love's entertainment lawyer. She'd been working with Courtney and Kurt on various legal matters for years. On April 4th, 1994, 4 days before Kurt's body was discovered, Rosemary had a conversation with Courtney that troubled her deeply. Rosemary has been very careful over the years about what she says publicly. Attorney-client privilege prevents her from revealing most of what she knows. But in a 1997 deposition related to an unrelated case, Rosemary made a statement that raised eyebrows. When asked about the timeline of Kurt's death, Rosemary said, "There are aspects of that situation that have never made sense to me. I had conversations with both Kurt and Courtney in early April that suggested very different narratives about what was happening in their relationship and what their plans were. Rosemary wouldn't elaborate, but people who knew her said she had serious doubts about the official story. She'd seen legal documents, she'd heard conversations, she knew things that didn't fit with the suicide narrative. One detail that Rosemary did confirm publicly, just days before his death, Kurt had contacted her about changing his will. He wanted to make sure that if anything happened to him, his assets would be protected in a way that benefited his daughter Frances, not necessarily his wife Courtney. Kurt was thinking about the future, Rosemary said, about protecting his child, about what would happen if his marriage ended. Those aren't the thoughts of someone planning to commit suicide. Those are the thoughts of someone planning to live. The pieces started to form a pattern. A phone call about meeting in 3 days. Lights in the greenhouse room after Kurt was supposedly dead. A page from Kurt's pager days after his supposed death. A lawyer being contacted about changing a will. Neighbors seeing strange cars. Friends receiving messages that suggested Kurt was planning a future. What if Kurt didn't die on April 5th? What if something else happened during those 72 hours that nobody has been willing to talk about? Michael Callie DeWitt was living in the Cobain house during this time. He'd been hired by Courtney to stay at the property and call if Kurt showed up. Callie's account of those days has always been vague and contradictory. Callie claimed he never saw Kurt, claimed he never heard anything unusual, claimed he was in the house but somehow didn't know that Kurt was dead in the greenhouse room just above where Callie was listening. But people who knew Callie said his story changed over the years. In early interviews, Callie said he'd been at the house continuously from April 2nd through April 8th. Later, he said he'd left for a day or two. Then he said he might have spent some nights elsewhere. The inconsistencies in Callie's story were never thoroughly investigated. He was a witness, but he was never treated as a suspect. Nobody asked the hard questions about how someone could live in a house for nearly a week without noticing a dead body in the room above their head. Dylan Carlson, Kurt's friend who received that late-night phone call on April 6th, has spent nearly 30 years trying to make sense of what happened. He's carried the weight of that final conversation, wondering if there was something he should have understood, something he should have done differently. Kurt sounded like someone making plans, Dylan said years later, not like someone saying goodbye. He was talking about the future, about seeing me in 3 days, about giving me something important. I've replayed that conversation in my head 1,000 times, and I can't reconcile what he said that night with what supposedly happened the next day. Dylan has never publicly stated that he believes Kurt was murdered. He's careful with his words, but he's been clear that something about the official story doesn't fit with what he experienced in those final days. The more you look at those final 72 hours, the more questions emerge. Questions about timelines that don't match. Questions about witnesses whose accounts were dismissed. Questions about evidence that was never seriously investigated. What happened in that greenhouse room? When did it really happen? Who was there? And why do so many witnesses report things that contradict the official timeline? The answers to these questions exist somewhere. In police files that were never fully examined, in witness statements that were never followed up on, in phone records and pager logs and legal documents that tell a different story than the one we've been told. Kurt Cobain's final 72 hours remain a mystery wrapped in contradictions. A phone call about meeting in 3 days. Lights moving in a room where a body was supposedly already dead. A page from a dead man's pager. Legal preparations for a future that would never come. Was Kurt planning to disappear? Was he trying to escape a life that had become unbearable? Or was something far darker happening during those 3 days? Something that ended not with a suicide but with something else entirely. The witnesses are still out there. The evidence still exists. The questions have never been answered. And somewhere in those final 72 hours lies the truth about what really happened to Kurt Cobain. If this investigation into Kurt's final days moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell for episode 3. Share this video with someone who wants to know the truth about those missing 72. What do you think really happened between April 5th and April 8th? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell so you don't miss the next episode where we investigate the people who were closest to Kurt in his final days and the motives that nobody wanted to discuss. The timeline doesn't add up. The witnesses tell a different story, and the truth about Kurt Cobain's final 72 hours is still waiting to be discovered.